Hi, everyone. Welcome to the second installment of this semester's Core Humanities Speaker Series. I'm Stephen Pasqualina. I'm a postdoc in the Core Humanities program at the University of Nevada, Reno. I'm very excited to be joined by a very special guest, Dr. Robert Yusef Rabiee, or as I call him, Rob. He's joining us today from Philadelphia. And I'll just give a brief introduction of Dr. Rabiee and then get into the format of today's discussion. Dr. Rabiee is an assistant professor in the Core Humanities program at Temple University. His work has appeared in a number of prestigious journals, including J19 and ESQ, and in the edited collection Left in the West, Literature, Culture, and Progressive Politics in the American West. I'll be interviewing him tonight about his recently published first book, featured prominently on his bookshelf and also in my hands here, titled Medieval America, Feudalism and Liberalism in 19th Century US Culture, which is available now from the University of Georgia Press and has been ordered by the University Library. So it will be available soon at UNR. Rob, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for inviting me, Stephen, and thanks to everyone for attending. I'm really excited for the conversation.
Yeah, me too. So tonight, the format of the discussion will be that I'll ask Dr. Rabiee a number of questions. I would love it if the audience also chimed in using the Q&A function below our faces. Just please type in your questions as they come to you, and I'll kind of include them as the conversation unfolds. So let's just get right into the meat and potatoes of the book. So let me start by asking, for those of us who have not read the book, could you tell us what it's about? What's the structure of the book? What's the argument of it? How does it respond to kind of standard or typical conceptions of the United States?
Yeah, absolutely. So the book began with this suspicion that the way that American history had been talked about sort of from really right after the founding of the country through to my own education and my own time, was based on some faulty assumptions about the US's relationship to Europe and to the feudal past specifically. So in the 18th, 19th centuries, you had a lot of historiographers of the United States saying things like, we have no connection to feudalism. We have, all of those things of the old world we've left behind, and we're starting something new. I opened the book with this passage from Tocqueville from Democracy in America, where he also makes this claim. There's a short story called Earth's Holocaust by Nathaniel Hawthorne that makes the same claim. The United States took all of the heraldry of old medieval times and sort of burned them as part of this new nation founding project. And that idea gets picked up and translated into the sort of common sense understanding of what the United States is and how the United States relates to the European past. And the major sort of proponent of this was a guy named Lewis Hartz, who's a political scientist and wrote a book called On the Liberal Consensus, this assumption that the United States only had liberalism. And really, my interest in this started from a very silly observation, which was I really enjoy, I love American literature. I study it, I care about it. I also really liked medieval literature and studied it and cared about it. And I started noticing sort of recurrent patterns in the literature. And then working, through grad school, through the archives, I started to find other traces of the medieval past and of the feudal past, specifically in law, really is where it shows itself most forcefully. So for instance, in the laws pertaining to marriage, those were coded directly from feudal marriage law and brought into the United States. And this proved to be a major bone of contention for the Seneca Falls generation of feminists who rightly saw that there was this bizarre situation where you had a putatively liberal republic founded on Enlightenment ideals that nonetheless treated a large portion of its populace as feudal subjects, as subjects who were under a different set of laws. And those kinds of patterns recur over and over and over again in 19th century US history. And so the structure of the book is basically to look at episodes of those moments where feudalism sort of emerges in the middle of the liberal tradition and is either rejected, because there are times when the U.S. looks at something. For instance, the chapter on James Fenimore Cooper The land titles at the center of that, this is in kind of upstate New York. There were these Dutch landholders who held feudal titles, and because they were loyal to the U.S. during the Revolution, to the what would become the U.S., loyal to the colonies during the Revolution, they were allowed to hold their feudal titles in place. So they were treated like lords, and then their tenants at some point said, "No, we want to be small farm proprietors." And ultimately, law in New York pretty quickly, after a fairly bloody battle, though, pretty quickly abolished that form of feudalism. Other forms of feudalism, like the feudalism surrounding marriage laws, or like the traces of feudal law surrounding marriage laws, were harder to get rid of. And so the book kind of looks at episodes and says, where did the U.S. reject feudalism out of hand and say, no, so sorry, not for us, not part of our national project? And where did they say, okay, like we can fold this in, this is good, America contains multitudes, we can bring in little bit of this feudal law to keep things sort of going the way we want them to keep going.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, excellent, Rob. Thank you. I actually had a question in the Q&A from Catherine Fusco, which was going to be my next question, a version of it. Yes. So if we zoomed out a second and thought about the terms in your title, right? You've got medieval, America we'll skip. We've got a map to show us what you're referring to there. This is focused on the United States primarily. Medieval, feudalism, liberalism. Could you talk about what these terms mean, how they're operating in the book, and how they kind of interrelate for you?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll take this opportunity too. I think Ned Schoolman asked a similar question about feudalism specifically. So I start with the broader kind of the three big terms, and then drill down a little further into
yep.
feudalism. Yeah. So these are, first off, these are slippery terms, and a lot of the work of especially revising from the dissertation to the final book form was trying to nail them down more exactly than I had at first. And there are still parts where I'm like, I think I could have defined this a little stronger. But my going definitions of these things, liberalism specifically, is this tradition of moderated relationships between landholding peoples and the state, right? Rather than the kind of absolute monarchies that controlled everything, this top-down manner, we have instead this system of compromises that emerges between what's seen as a citizenry of a country and what's seen as the ruling state apparatus of that country. And so I take this from like Edmund Fawcett in his big popular history of liberalism, where he says that the heart of liberalism is not abolishing contradictions in society, but harmonizing contradictions in society, right? So not to say that you want to create a system where there is no kind of great inequality between peoples, but instead, how do you maintain social order and peace while still maintaining differences in class and status and so on? And that tradition, in the introduction to the book is mapped, in the normal ways you would expect, back to John Locke and back to the 18th century and to those Enlightenment philosophers who were really instrumental in forming that. Feudalism is harder, much harder to define, because it's a more or less a 19th century invention, right? One of the great and really mind-blowing observations that I came across in researching what medievalists say about this term feudalism is like, well, it's a term of distancing. It's a way of saying, everything we like is progressive and modern and liberal. Everything we don't like is feudal. And there's a very good argument to be made that the feudal system, quote unquote, since it was never codified and it was always different in different areas of Europe, can't be treated as a monolith in the same way liberalism is. And I try to make that evident in the book to the best of my abilities. To the specific question from Ned Schoolman here, I really do connect it to English common law more than anything else. The places where you see the most, to my mind, the most direct importations of feudal tradition is within the law and within the framework of law, right? And this bizarre kind of moment you might have, and I talk about this in the introduction as well, but I tried to imagine what it would be like to be a small landholder in the US who's going into a court and starting to hear these like Latinate terms and these, bizarre sort of Byzantine arguments. And sometimes in some decisions, you get references to 12th and 13th century law as well. And they would say, I think rightly, like, wait, I thought this was the land of futurity. I thought we broke from that. We're not part of that, right? But it still nonetheless is sort of brought in. The other aspect of feudalism that I'm super interested in, and this is the kind of Edmund Burke, right? The like father of modern conservatism, who was writing against the French Revolution, talks about the genius of these aristocracies that endure over history and that have this level of artifice about them that helps to instill social order simply just by their existence, right? The existence of a elaborate series of landed gentry who kind of control the lion's share of social power in your country offers a good base for stability, according to Burke. And that's the other part of feudalism I'm really interested in. So there's the specific concrete moments of feudal law being adapted into US law. And then there's also this other structure, this other set of images, symbols, and patterns that seem to be sort of imposing a aristocratic view of society on the US, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I think it's interesting how you describe feudalism in ways that are similar to liberalism, in that they're both ways of imposing order, right? I want to kind of carry this question a bit to the medieval part of the title. So you write in the introduction in a moment about the distinction between the medieval and the feudal, and how in the 19th century, there's a slippage among a lot of the thinkers that you're writing about between these terms, and that the 19th century US constructs a myth of the medieval. And much of what you do in this book is kind of going back and forth between medieval history and medieval kind of mythology in the 19th century, right? Mark Twain called it, what was it? Who's the Ivanhoe? The name's
Walter,
Walter Scott disease, right? So, I wonder if you could talk about the purpose of studying the myth versus the actual historical kind of work that you're doing. The range of references in this book, by the way, I would say, is intimidating and brilliant, because you have to be doing both kind of 19th century US culture and at the same time the history of English common law and the absorption of it into the US. But if you could talk about the medieval myth that gets constructed in the 19th century US.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that this is where the book overlaps with discussions of like Romanticism, right?
Mm-hmm.
And Romanticism as a reaction against the Enlightenment, right? So you have this sort of, in the 19th century, emerging these schools of like the Gothic and of the Romantic that both look at what they viewed as the kind of cold, mechanistic world of the Enlightenment and said, no, we want romance, we want passion, we're sort of, we're interested in revolution, but we're also kind of terrified of revolution. They were always ambivalent on that count. And I think that the way that the Middle Ages, at least in the early 19th century in the US, was adapted was really through those kinds of fantastical forms, right? There wasn't much primary text medieval work being read or discussed or promulgated in the US at the very beginnings, right? Now what's interesting, and this is where the book kind of ends with Emerson, is that after the Civil War, especially in the North and especially centered around Harvard because of this scholar named Charles Eliot Norton, who was a great scholar of Dante. And then you also had Francis Child, who was adapting folk ballads from Europe and sort of publishing and trying to codify them. Towards the end of the 19th century, middle to end, you start to get more directly medieval texts that are being quoted and cited. And there are always these funny and strange little moments, like Anna Julia Cooper, who was a Black woman, a Black feminist of the time, in her writings about slavery and about its specific effect on Black women, is quoting Christine de Pizan suddenly, right? That's the stuff where it's less about the fantasy and it's more like, oh man, they're actually reading Like they're reading this stuff and they're interested in this stuff. American thinkers want to understand how they can wrangle with the medieval past and what use and what utility it can have for them. So the slippage is always in this case, as you said, Stephen, between like the romantic, the gothic, the fantastical, the kind of sword and sorcery, misty castle with a dragon circling around it, Middle Ages, which was definitely there and which I talk a lot about in the book, but then also the sort of more grounded actual medieval history that starts to become of more interest and of more importance in the US as the century progresses. And really that's where a book like No Place of Grace, like TJ Lear's book, is really about that period of medievalism, especially into the Gilded Age and after. And I'm almost tracing the evolution from, in the literary sense of the book, tracing the evolution from the fantastical, romantic, and Gothic into the more serious and scholarly medieval stuff towards the end of the century. So subsequently, like the Emerson chapter ends up being the one where you get the most actual medieval literature discussed and most directly discussed, because Emerson and all of his circle at Harvard were really actually reading this stuff,
Right. I want to flag that Jackson Lear's point, maybe come back to that, as well as your fascination that you kind of elaborated on in the conclusion of the book with 1980s, medieval culture and video games and movies. But I want to get to this question from Ned Schoolman, which I think is an excellent question, something that we've kind of talked about, both teaching core humanities programs at UNR. The program I teach in was formerly called Western Traditions, right? So this question of Western civilization that emerges in the 19th century. So Ned Schoolman's question here is, in your understanding, is the promotion of the medieval myth in the 19th century US also connected to efforts to canonize a Western civilization history in the later 19th century, something that we still are dealing with today?
Yes, like fully. Yes, absolutely. And that's an amazing question first off. And I think it's astute. Yeah, that it was part of the shoring up of this idea of Western civilization that really, what's I think from my perspective, what's, the most upsetting thing in several of the more upsetting moments of this book as I was researching it, was seeing moments where things could go the other way, right? Seeing moments where the US could have, and did in fact engage in experiments that really were kind of new and were trying to break out of the kind of ruts of tradition that they had been caught in. But ultimately all of that energy in my reckoning was sort of funneled into, as Ned says in this question, was funneled into this kind of West and the rest narrative, right? And it's subsequently no sort of accident that in the 2015 2016 era of the sort of alt-right, the new right, whatever people are calling it, basically the pre-QAnon right, that you had a resurgence in medieval iconography and imagery and like crusader.
You have it in QAnon too,
yeah.
right?
Oh yeah. Like the Q shaman is like
right
covered in stuff, right? Yeah. And so it's super, like I think, yeah, Ned, I agree. I think that it was part of the establishment of this, like, Western canon. And there's one episode, and this is again mentioned towards the end of the Emerson chapter. Kathleen Davis wrote this study of university architecture, which is super interesting. And she noted the number of times that you get big things that are like, the words that are carved on the tops of libraries or law schools. And you often get orders that'll go like Charlemagne, Lincoln, right? Like they're making these connections really, really strongly. And it's part of, I think, the effort to legitimize the US project, right? In the eyes of the older sovereignties and the older nations. There's an effort to say, hey, actually, we're the natural continuation and endpoint of all of your development. Europe is tired and it should go to sleep. The US is where the traditions of Europe will come to flower again, is kind of the idea.
Yeah, speaking of this kind of construction of a white European tradition, which is completely fabricated in the 19th century, we just received a question from Marie-Christine Garcia, who asks, The work that the title of the monograph, what is it doing in the 21st century, medieval America? So she notes that it often connotes references to demonstrations of white supremacy when we talk about the medieval in the 21st century, with the example of Charlottesville, and co-opted indigeneity. So most recently seen in the image of the QAnon shaman who you just mentioned, seen as a sort of like Viking figure. And as Ned Schoolman touched on the canonization myth element of the question of white supremacy, but the question here is, do you piece touches, or does your book touch on elements of indigeneity, as in white people feeling indigenous to Europe? And I will say, yes, it absolutely does, but I'm going to let you explain how.
Yeah, no, Marie-Christine, yes, it does, and it does in a couple of interesting ways. So I think that if I'm understanding the question as you're posing it, you're asking, does it talk about European peoples feeling that they have like an organic connection to Europe? And the answer there is yeah. And really anything that I do in that is taken from a historian, early kind of 1980s and 90s, so a little less recent, named Reginald Horsman, who wrote a book called Race and Manifest Destiny. And the place where you see this, and actually, it's nuts you mentioned this, because I think, like many of us, I fill my head with things that I don't like that, I listen to things that I don't find pleasant for research. But Alex Jones recently did this sort of narrative where he's like, liberty began with the Anglo-Saxons and moved to the United States. This big grand claim that he was making. I was listening to this podcast about Alex Jones called Knowledge Fight, and they were like, where does he get this? Where does he get this idea that liberty began with white Anglo-Saxon men? And the answer is he gets it from the 19th century. He gets it from the idea that Anglo-Saxon men were constitutionally made for this kind of rough, they described as tribal democracy, right, and parliamentarism. And they believed that of themselves. And this is where I think Mark Twain and his Walter Scott reference, the novel Ivanhoe is about this time, this like mythical Anglo-Saxon past. And so, yes, I do think that Anglo-American people viewed themselves as indigenously European and saw their political forms as emerging from their indigeneity as specifically as Anglo-Saxons, which is of course an invented term anyway of all these things. And this leads to some, to the many problems we have with, bringing in new, even European subjects who were not Anglo-Saxon, right? So Italian and Irish immigrants, Polish immigrants, and German immigrants were viewed, Greek immigrants as well, were viewed with suspicion, because there was that assumption like, yeah, you're European, but you're not British. And if you're not British, then I'm not really sure you're capable of democracy, right? So that's the first place where it touches on indigeneity. Secondly, I do write sort of extensively about assumptions of indigenous identity on the part of white settlers in this chapter on James Fenimore Cooper, because the arguments that are made, and it's really super, and these are like, by the way, Cooper is always boring. The 3 Cooper novels that I write about are like the most boring of all the boring Coopers. So this is not saying to go off and read them. Read Wikipedia entries if you want. But
this is why you have friends like Rob, so that he'll read those novels for you. Yeah,
exactly. Who will subject you to the same pain, right? Like, Stephen, I read the worst thing in the world. I have to share it with you now. But the Cooper novels are interesting because it's a battle between these Mohawk Valley patroons, these Dutch landholding elite in upstate New York, and then these small farm settlers who are trying to peel away from their feudal titles. And what ultimately ends up happening is the way that Cooper squares the argument is he has both parties, so meaning the white landlords and the white settlers, basically get into a battle over who's going to get the affection of the Onondaga people, who are, as in all of these kinds of racist myths of indigeneity in the US, are portrayed as vanishing. and on the verge of stepping out the door, right? It's like their civilization's almost done, but then the drama of this Satan's Toe, this like little page manuscript sequence of novels is who is going to get the imprimatur of the last Onondaga in this area. And it ends up being the feudal landlords, right? So then the feudal landlords start saying, well, we're indigenous to this land because look, Sesquisus gave us permission to be indigenous to this land, whereas he looked at the settlers who were rioting against having to pay their rents and said, nope, they're not indigenous, even though in the novels they dress up in sort of mock native clothing to do these theatrical demonstrations. So in that case, I'm talking directly about indigeneity in his in his honest terms I can, relying of course on indigenous scholars who have been doing this work for decades. And like in those moments in that chapter specifically, I more often than not say this is something that has been done elsewhere. Like there's nothing original. Like there's nothing original in what I'm saying about indigeneity. This is something someone else has done already, and I'm graciously using it and citing it and trying to signal boost it as best I can. But then the interesting stuff does come in the ways that Americans start to battle over, you know, if they have this belief that indigenous peoples are gone, then somebody's going to be the new indigenous person, and it'll be white settlers. Basically, they'll play act as Indians, you know.
So I want to get into the theoretical apparatus of the book, and this question from Alex Young gets us there, I think. So Alex writes, one of the things that fascinates me about this book is the ways that it troubles the familiar Marxist categories of residual and emergent in cultural studies. And he says, is there a sense in which the feudal idea of order, that's a phrase, that's a section of the book is titled The Feudal Idea of Order, and maybe you could touch on what that means for you. Is there a sense in which the feudal idea of order is evoked in response to the maturation of capitalism in the US, as heightened inequalities foreclose liberal myths about the egalitarian effects of capitalist political economy? And he's thinking especially here about the Cooper chapter, he writes.
That's interesting. Let me think about that for a second. So while I'm thinking through that, the feudal idea of order stuff we kind of discussed in describing like the key terms of the book. So the primary way this expresses itself is like through law, right? But also through deference, like taught deference to superiors. And then the place where I think I have the most sort of fun as like a literary scholar, as a cultural critic, is in talking about feudal aesthetics and the idea, you know, the vision of the Lord as the author of a world, right? The author of whatever their world might be, whether it's the plantation in the case of Poe, whether it's the feudal estate in the case of Cooper, or whether it's the business in the case of like Ayn Randian kind of, you know, Atlas Shrugged type people. These are all, to me, emanations of a feudal type because of that connection they share between mastery on the one hand and aesthetic mastery on the other. Now, the question I think that Alex is getting at here, it gives me pause because I'm not quite sure. Like I have contradictory answers to it. On the one hand, yes, I think that as the U.S. matured, and this is the kind of arc of the book, right? Feudalism became this apparatus for making things that were pretty intolerable seem tolerable, right? So the sort of occasion that I discuss most directly in the Emerson chapter is that in the 1870s there were these armed sort of workers' rebellions throughout, you know, Massachusetts being this like industrial area. There were armed workers sort of rebellions everywhere, and the answer to this from Harvard at that time was to drill the Harvard militiamen in front of Memorial Hall, which is this massive Gothic structure. If any of you have been up to Cambridge, you can see it's really hard to miss. It's like Notre Dame in the middle of Cambridge, Massachusetts. And in that case, I do think, yes, like that is a case of feudalism asserting itself as like, okay, the system is what it is, the class roles are ossified, and now we need a mythos to make those ossified class roles okay, right? So We're going to say, well, these aren't just businessmen. These are the equivalents of the new noblemen of our time. And like a good serf, you laborers should defer to them and assume that they are, looking out for you and that they have God's favor and the favor of the state. So why would you rebel against them, right? And if you don't get that part of the message, then we'll put a rifle in your face, right? That's where it's used to reaffirm the categories. But what's interesting to me is that the primal scenes of a lot of capitalist accumulation at this time were also deeply feudal, right? So for instance, on a ship, let's take that as an example. On a ship, this thing that Melville writes about extensively, you are subject to the sovereignty of a single human on the ship, right? And you were trained. When Melville writes about life on the sea, he tends to write about it in feudal terms, right? So he talks about knights and squires and lords and all of these things. And it's not, I don't think, accidental that he does that. It's not just colorful language. I think it's his way of signaling that at the heart of capitalist exchange, you have spaces that are managed like feudal regimes, right? It doesn't mean that the whole system is managed in that way, but certainly the deck of the ship is managed in that way, right? Similar arguments were made about slavery in the South and about the slave plantation, right? The only lie there is that the slave plantation was infinitely worse than the feudal estate, because the serf was never owned in body, right? The serf was assumed to have some small agency, and they couldn't, for instance, be sold just directly and brutalized in the same ways that a bondsperson in the 18th, 19th centuries could have been. But still, in the way that the feudal or that the Southern elite talk about themselves, they also view themselves as feudal lords, right? So at another center of capitalist accumulation, the cotton industry, which was a major motor both for the US and for England, right? So we're now in a transnational, a transatlantic mode. We have a little feudal estate at the heart of it. So it kind of appears, I think, Alex, I hope this answered it, on both ends of the spectrum, right? It appears at the beginnings of the system in its most raw, kind of the coal mine, the ship's deck, the plantation, the reservation, all of these spaces. And then it also appears at the higher end of things as a justification for the aristocrats.
Great, thank you, Rob. I wanted to ask this question that Catherine Fusco just added about Mark Twain. What's at stake, do you think, in someone like Twain making fun of Americans for taking up Arthurian legends? I thought about Twain a lot in this book. You mentioned Twain here and there, but he doesn't get the focused treatment that, say, Melville or Harriet Jacobs or Cooper get. So maybe talk about.
You wrote better about him, like that.
Yeah.
You did a better job. I had to defer. Stevens.
Connecticut Yankee and King Arthur's Court would fit in this book. It goes past the timeline that you set out for this one, but maybe in a follow-up.
Well, and that was partly the reason for Twain not appearing beyond, like, he appears in sort of the margins, and I quote the famous Walter Scott thing from Life on the Mississippi, where he's like, the Walter Scott disease deranged the South and made them all think that they were, lords and ladies and so on. I think that, I mean, and this is really like the stuff on Emerson and the stuff on the higher order, feudalism that we were just discussing, like, an aristocracy justifying itself. There is some, like, I mean, I think that the comedy of it for me is that there's something like kind of patently ridiculous about Hank Morgan being like, I, a captain of industry, would go back and show them what's what, right? Like, I'll impose order on this unruly past, and because of my technological prowess, I'll be elevated to the level of a god. And I think that, like, it is kind of funny whenever you see a meme of like a businessman with a knight's helmet on, right? Or like commercials that traffic in these kinds of pseudo medieval or medieval-esque images and then associate them with, somebody who makes tires. And there's nothing wrong with making tires, right? But there's also maybe no reason to romanticize it into like, the new knights and the new noblemen. So for me, that's where I always, like, that's the comedy of the novel to me, is like, it's just a little pretentious for these business people to walk around saying, like, not only do we control all the material wealth of this country, but also we're basically kings. So take the knee. And that's like that's both horrifying because sometimes they win, but then in the hands of a satirist like Twain, it becomes uproarious because you're like, well, what's this guy talking about? Is he gonna, I'm not gonna bend a knee to Hank Morgan? Are you kidding me? That's ridiculous, you know?
Right. You mentioned labor in your answer to that question, and the idea of business people being associated with knighthood. I wanted to ask you a question about kind of a theoretical element of the book, which I really enjoy, which is I think you do a great job in this book of grappling with how literature can respond to economic and material concerns. And these often I mean, in our experience, I think with students often, they're sometimes kind of stunned that literature is engaging with historical material forces. Could you talk a little bit about how you see that relationship between literature and economics and material concerns, and how the book specifically kind of bridges that gap between literature and political economy?
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, right before the call, like Steve and I were talking about this because it's a question that I wrangle with, and that I think it requires in writing and in thinking and in teaching and everything we all do. You know, it requires some care, because the danger, of course, is that you overdetermine one or the other, right? So I'm not a fan of literary studies that are just about like the beauty and perfection of the prose, no matter how that's coded, whether that's coded as it's the beauty and perfection, or it's coded as a new formalism, or whatever it might be. I just am not excited by books like that. I am very excited by very dry histories and by, you know, Marxist historiography and things like that. But then again, if I wanted to do that, I wouldn't be studying literature. Does that make sense? So there has to be a balance between the two. And one of the places in the book that I wrestled with that the most, and that I still wrestle with whenever I teach this author to my students, is with Edgar Allan Poe. Because on the one hand, like of all of the authors I'm talking about, you know, some people have heard of James Fenimore Cooper. I'm thinking about students, by the way. Like I'm thinking about like my average undergraduate students. They've heard maybe of James Fenimore Cooper. They maybe have heard of Ralph Waldo Emerson. It's kind of dimly in there. He's not taught as much as he used to. I don't think know anything about like John Rollinridge. Some of them are like, oh yeah, Melville, he wrote Bartleby. But when you talk about Poe, that's when people get excited, because Poe, for a lot of us, myself included, represented the first sort of falling in love with literature that we did, right?
I was going to say, you earlier said you take in a lot of things you hate, but you do love Poe, and you start the book with Poe.
I love Poe. Yeah.
That chapter, it's the first chapter of the book, and it really seems like you working through your enthusiasm for Poe's tales, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And working through being from Kentucky too, which is a quiet theme of the book in general.
Kentucky plays a large role in this book. I'd like to get to that too.
An outsized role, one might say, but yeah, it's there's a lot of Kentucky, there's a lot of the South/Midwest. But with the Poe, it really, yes, I love Poe, and my, you know, I wouldn't have loved literature if I hadn't have been introduced to Poe at a certain point in time, when I was, you know, young enough to kind of fall in love with it, but old enough to understand, you know, because his writing is still, it can be a little, it's hard, you know. And that's also the fun of Poe when you're that young, is like, he's the most challenging thing you've laid your eyes on, and you're like, I've got to figure this out. I have to solve this riddle, you know, like what did happen in the Rue Morgue, right? Things like this. And in coming to write about Poe, and in coming to read the kind of, I think, and I don't like, Poe Society does not agree, by the way, but I would say incontrovertible evidence of Poe's pro-slavery attitudes and his material interests. And this is maybe connecting it back to this economics question, his material interest in the cultural apparatus of the pro-slavery world, right? So it's something that I think we don't tend to think of immediately, but all of those debates about slavery produced journals and novels, and stage plays, and every form of cultural representation you can think of in defense of the slavocracy, right? Including these, you know, famous anti-Tom novels. So the novels that took Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin and flipped it and said, actually, Uncle Tom would have been happier if he had stayed. You know, if everyone would have been happier if they had stayed on the plantation and so on. I talk about one in the book called Swallow Barn by John Pendleton Kennedy, which is another terrible thing that you really don't worry about. It's bad. Just read a summary. Read Medieval America to read the summary of Pendleton Kennedy, Waka Waka. But ignoring the fact that Poe was publishing in these venues, that for several years he was the editor of a pro-slavery magazine, that when he was trying to get his sort of ill-fated Poe's journal, you know, his personal journal that he wanted, published, in a letter to one of his financiers in Philadelphia, he says, I think that the landowners and great men in the Southwest frontier have an appetite for the kinds of stories I write. You might pass over that and be like, oh, okay, he says that wealthy people want to read him. Who were the wealthy people in the Southwest frontier? They were slavers, they were owners of plantations. What was life in the Southwest frontier at that time like? It was brutal. It was considerably worse than to be enslaved in the Southwest than it was to be enslaved on the Atlantic coast, just sort of objectively, where the pushing system of just most of the most brutal exploitations of labor in American history was engineered in that laboratory. And Poe, as he's trying to make money, is thinking like, oh, they're gonna like this. They're gonna like what I have to do. They're gonna like this scary, gross, weird stuff, right? So I think, you know, there's no argument to me against looking at those kinds of things in considering an author's output. And I this is where I do become much more historicist than many literary critics have tended to be for a while. I think there's always a back and forth between these things, but sort of in the post death of the author, you know, don't commit the intentional fallacy, don't look at their biography, you know, focus strictly on the poetry of the words and these sorts of things.
Mhm.
It's seen as kind of rude to say that Poe made money off of enslaved people, both directly in the form of selling an enslaved person, and then also indirectly in selling to the people who sold and tortured enslaved people. But it's the fact, and there's no sort of escaping it. And then the difficulty becomes, what do you do with Poe? What do you do with him? And and honestly, I taught several Poe stories last semester in this class on race in the US at Temple. And once my students and I came to the end of reading them, we all came to the same thing, which is like, I don't know what to do with it. Like it's awful, and I don't know how to square it. But it is, I think, the fact of the matter is that Poe has to be viewed as a pro-slavery, if not a plantation romance author of some stripe.
Mhm. And plantation romances absolutely would fit into this book as maybe another chapter. Um, Mike Petiti has a question that kind of segues into a question I wanted to ask. So Mike asks, this feudal liberal synthesis, as you call it in the book, where do we see it today, particularly in popular culture? And I wanted to kind of add to that a little addition, which is to say that, especially in the conclusion, but throughout the book, really, one of the things I think that stands out to me about this very serious, very historicist academic monograph is that you weave in self-reflections and personal experience. I'm thinking particularly about your reflection in the Emerson chapter on your summers spent at the Carnegie Center and Andrew Carnegie's kind of feudal imagination, or your references to 1980s video games like Zelda, or to Star Wars, right? So like the pop culture that you grew up with informing your interest in this phenomenon. So I wonder if you could talk about your kind of experience or the larger cultural milieu of the late 20th, early 21st century, kind of grappling with this liberal feudal synthesis from the 19th century.
Yeah. And I think so. One of the things that I like, an underlying kind of assumption. This is something that I get from like the old cultural studies, like the Stuart Hall kind of and Raymond Williams, you know, model, is that a lot of these, and this is a term specifically from Raymond Williams, is like the structure of feeling, of
Mhm.
being in a specific time, and the ways that existing in a historical period is not always coded intellectually, right? But that we understand it effectively. We understand it in the moment the occurrence of the thing in an emotional way, and then later we kind of rationalize it, right, and come to understand it and study it, and that's why we study things. But that primary moment of feeling is still like of primary importance to these questions. And really, like, whenever, and I kind of try to gesture to this in the at the end of the introduction, but whether you view like the US, this feudal synthesis that I'm sort of proposing that operate in the US as first existing or not existing, or second as a positive thing or a negative thing, depends on which side of that you fall on, right? Whether you view yourself as in the tradition of the lords, in the tradition of the masters, being trained to be a part of that, or whether you view yourself as one of the commanded peoples, as one of the serfs, as someone who must obey, right? Emerson says in his later writings that the masses must be tamed and drilled, right, by these men who, in his reckoning, breed estates as the sky breeds clouds, right? So that sets up a pretty obvious dichotomy between these two things. You can either be the creator of estates, or you can be the person who is tamed and drilled by the creators of estates. And I think that the pop culture stuff and the personal stuff that comes in is an attempt to anchor that in lived experience, and to anchor it in the place where you first notice it, right? Or don't notice it, crucially, right? So for instance, the Carnegie example, I had no idea. You don't know. Like, you're a kid. You go to a Carnegie Center and it's fun and it's nice, right? You have no sense that in fact you're doing something that puts you, in the lineage of this sort of direct, first off, deeply exploitative people, like monster human. But secondly, a person who viewed himself as a lord, sort of pouring down his grace on the world. You just view it as like, oh, that's the old building that I go to, and like I play Roger Rabbit with my friends, after school, whatever. Learn about poetry, whatever we did, and that deep study of any kind. This is another Christina Pizan thing, actually. The path of long study, like the path of long study, forces you to reevaluate your own life, and forces you to reevaluate the experiences you took as given, and as transparent, and as non-events, right? Oh, I went to this place in the summers, it doesn't mean anything. Actually, yeah, it kind of does. And study allows you to see that. And I think that every scholar does that. And I don't know that every scholar includes it in the book, but
Right.
I just wanted to include it because I couldn't imagine writing it without those sorts of things. So
No,
yeah,
I think it's
there's that.
outstanding that you kind of genuinely weave in personal experience, which I think, of course, structures any of our projects, but often kind of under the surface.
Under the surface, because you have to risk. You don't want to be self-indulgent about it. You can't do an autobiography because it's not that. But at the right time, the one or two little anecdotes, or a paragraph of an anecdote, I think is well served. And it also just humanizes the author, and hopefully makes it a little bit more, because academic books are dry, right? And like but if we want to get our messages out, maybe to larger audiences, it may require more of these bridging moments, to say, like, this is a human writing this, right? And a human who actually is not like a human who was raised in Kentucky in the 80s, and like is more comfortable talking about the Legend of Zelda than the Bayeux Tapestry, because my life was the Legend of Zelda, not the Bayeux Tapestry, right? Like, I'm more comfortable talking about Walmart than I am talking about Saks Fifth Avenue. Same
But
sort of.
your conclusion ends with this Kentucky castle that you meditate on. And I wanted to ask you a question related to the conclusion that also brings us into the 21st century. So I'm going to call out your Twitter account here. You tweeted on February 9th that the governor of Nevada, Steve Sisolak, he proposed inviting tech companies to create local governments in Nevada.
Yeah.
And you tweeted that this is literally the conclusion to medieval America. So this is, like, of course, a very curious thing to say. What do you mean by that? How does this, what should we learn from this as well? Because, as many of us living and working in Nevada, how is this connected to your book?
Well, so the conclusion gets into some possible ramifications of these things. And this is where like the stuff Mike was asking about in that question, like where do we see it today? One place we see it is in like private security forces, right? Both on the big level, your like Blackwater level, which Eric Prince is more than happy to talk about the Middle Ages when he's talking about Blackwater and his project there, sort of private defense contractors. But you also see it in like the private security forces hired by corporations or hired by housing communities and things like that, right? Like exclusive housing enclaves and things. As silly as that sounds, it is a little bit of the feudal. It's the feudal reasserting itself, you know, especially if you take the idea of like the ability of a lord to defend their manor as being kind of the heart of what the compromise is between the crown and the lord, right? And so in this case, if you want to view the crown as the state and the lord as the owner of that parcel of land who is able to patrol it according to their own kind of sovereign dictates and do control the power of life and death on that land as well, then you can see the parallel more strongly. And this plays into ideas of corporate sovereignty. And like right when I was starting to write the book, I encountered two things that like blew my mind, man. One of them was a book by the historian Karen Oren called Belated Feudalism. And it was her argument, and I like love this book. It's short, like read it, it's beautiful. She was a historian at UCLA, and it's incredible writing, and she's very funny and very angry the whole time. But she was writing about labor law in the US, and that labor law had also been imported from, in many cases, the old law of master and servant, especially in common law. And that in her mind, proper liberalism, which again, I think we would, you know, she was not a Marxist, so she would not have the same issues with liberalism that I do as a Marxist, but Warren was a liberal, and she said proper liberalism didn't come to the United States until the labor movement and until the founding of unions where individuals had more power as a collective, right? Which is her like cool thing. She's like, actually, the individual in the union has more power to bargain and to democratically steer their workplace than does the lone person making individual contracts with their employers, right? The other one was a book whose name is like escaping me now, but it was a Russian scholar and a scholar at West Virginia University who talked about corporate sovereignty as a form of feudalism, right? And applied, I think that book came out in 2011, and applied it directly to like shopping malls and things like this, or like the ways that companies can now claim and stake things and create little mini states out of them. And what amazed me when I saw that Sizzlehack thing, I was like, it's beyond like the fig leaf of claiming that the state matters anymore, right? In this case, he's saying like, okay, blockchain LLC, take it, build a county. Like, and what are the limits to blockchain LLC's sovereignty over that county? Can they tax people? Can they arrest people? If a murder is committed on their land, can they execute people? Like, where will the limits of blockchain's sovereignty go? And it's also connected to several other projects sort of globally. There's Neom in Saudi Arabia, sort of bin Salman's city of the future. There's also Akon City in Senegal, like the first cryptocurrency paradise. You know, who knows if any of this will get built, right? Because like they very well may not, but at least in theory, it does seem like a way that the moneyed interests of our time are separating themselves from the old state structures and establishing these autonomous zones that will function according to their law. And that to me is actually back to Ned's question. That is the administrative feudalism of, you know, really becoming born again, you know. And you even get this sense, there's like sort of a flip way that we talk about, you know, like, oh yeah, it's neo-feudal, oh yeah, there are lords, oh, Jeff Bezos is a king, and so on. And it seems just like a joke, but I think that the joke reveals a genuine anxiety about a country with such ossified class structures and a legal system willing to defend those ossified class structures, that we are effectively reduced to serfs.
Absolutely. Ned just in the Q&A linked to an article about the castle that I believe you closed the book with. Could you talk a little bit about the castle and your experience with the castle? And so there's this castle in Kentucky it's a fascinating story that ends this book. But go ahead, Rob.
I just loved it when I was a kid. So the castle was built in the 1960s, and I like it was, I look, this is another one of those things where like writing just disillusions you.
This is in Lexington, correct?
In Lexington,
Right?
yeah, it's on the
Where you're
board. It's on
from?
the fringes of where I'm from, out in the country. So it's between like Lexington and Fayette County and Woodford County. It's like right on the line. It was built by a land developer. It was supposed to be his house. Like it was sort of his folly. He thought it was fun. It had all these cool myths around it, but then once I started looking at the old newspaper archives, I was like, it's just a failed building project. Damn it! Like nobody hanged themselves in the castle keep, out of sorrow. Like none of the creepy stuff that really interested me when I was a kid happened. But what is interesting is that it's now, and this is an irony of ironies that makes writing a pleasure, right? Um, he, the current owner of the castle, has turned it into like a normal resort, but with a farm to table restaurant. And they boast about the fact that they grow all the produce on the grounds. And they're like, that's an autarky. That is exactly like that is properly getting towards a feudal manner. It's not very far off, right? But then the American innovation, the thing that we did was we made it democratic, right? So if you've got enough money, you can go be the lord for one night. You know, I think Stephen, if I'm gonna quote something you said though, but you said that when we were talking about it, you said like reading the end of the book was sort of like it felt like America was like downing a monster and going like feudalism, all right, let's do it. And that
Right.
that
Just a
is
total acceptance of like, okay, you want to say that we absorb feudalism as Whitman does, right? You close with Whitman, the epigraph and the conclusion. Whitman says the United States absorbs the past, including feudalism, right? So sure. Right.
why not? And we can, I think what's interesting too though is that the efforts to democratize it are much less like we don't really care about democratizing that feudal idea anymore, right? So something like Disneyland, which I write about kind of briefly in the Poe chapter, just as a illustrative thing of like
Mhm.
Splash Mountain and the traditions of slavery and so on. But something like that was like an attempt in my mind, to democratize that feudal ideal, right? And to really get buy-in from kids. So it's like, you can come and dress up as a hero or a princess, and for this day, for this set amount of money, you're going to be treated in this way that is akin to what you imagine a feudal lord or a king or a queen or a princess would have been treated like. And it gets you to buy into the idea that maybe one day I actually could be one of these people. And what's interesting to me lately is that the classes in the United States who have the most vested interest in sort of shoring up an idea of American aristocracy really don't care about democratizing it now. It feels more like an outright assertion of wealth, status, and privilege than it does an effort to say like, hey, bud, I'm just like you. You could be like me too. It really is kind of like, no, we live in Calabasas and we are an alien species to you who you delight in and enjoy watching, but don't ever dream that you could be like us. And that is kind of a crucial difference, I think, in the 21st century. It's becoming much more deterministic.
And exacerbated during COVID as well.
And yes, greatly exacerbated during COVID. That's absolutely true, because your ability to isolate yourself in your own realm, right, in your own little sovereignty, in your own domain, is directly connected to class status, right? There were people for whom this was not a lockdown.
Right. We're short on time. Very quickly, as briefly as you can, could you tell us what's next? What are you working on now? What are your future projects?
Yeah, I'm working. So I am right now starting to work on a book about crisis in American culture. So economic crisis. I actually started taking notes before COVID, and then they were all pinned up on my wall in my office on campus, and I was like, that seems like good timing. So I'm looking at that, and specifically, kind of the inciting incident is the first. It is 1850s global panic that really destabilized capital in like a very serious way, and destabilized the industrial regime. And I sort of begin there and look at effects of this in literature, specifically again in Melville and like The Confidence Man and Israel Potter and these sort of lesser discussed texts of his. and then continue to sort of analyze archives around economic crises to understand. This is one where I sort of came in with a vague idea of what I wanted to do with medieval America. Here, I just know that I'm interested in studying what American culture does during crisis. And I don't have any kind of preconceived ideas about what that'll look like. I just know that hopefully it'll produce something cool. And then beyond that, just, you know, teaching and living, being happy with these pups.
Yeah, Rob's dog has been in the background if you haven't noticed.
And he's been a very good boy.
He's been excellent.
Very good boy.
We're right against time. So I want to thank Dr. Rabiee for an excellent conversation. I really learned a lot in our conversation. And thank you all for your excellent questions throughout the discussion. I want to also thank those who have helped financially support the program, as well as kind of administratively, Dean Modelmog, Lisa McDonald, Colby Sunderland from the College of Liberal Arts, Rishi Bednarski, Chris Stansel, Catherine Fusco, Breton Rodriguez, and the entire Core Humanities Programming Committee. And of course, again, Dr. Rabiee and you for joining us tonight. Thank you all. Have a wonderful night. And I hope you stay safe and healthy.